This is Theater Talk. I'm Susan Haskins, and here to introduce our very special guest is my co-host, Michael Riedel of the New York Post.
We're great fans of the playwright Edward Albee, and this coming season in New York, you're going to have a lot of great plays of his to choose from. Coming up at Second Stage very soon is a play called Peter and Jerry.
It's running now.
It's running now, yes, which is, the second act is the Zoo Story, the play that began Edward's career, and the first act is a new play he's written called Home Life, which is sort of the setup to the Zoo Story. Later on this fall, you're going to see Me, Myself, and I at the McCarter Theater that we hope will be transferring to New York at some point. There is a revival of The American Dream and Sandbox at the Cherry Lane that Edward will be directing. And in the spring, Occupant, a play of his about his friend Louise Nevelson, that was supposed to have been seen in New York a few years ago with Anne Bancroft. But Edward is bringing that back now, and we're happy that all of these shows are here, and we're delighted that he himself, Edward Albee, is our guest tonight on Theater Talk.
There's one thing we ought to straighten up right now.
Yes.
Somebody's going to get the crazy idea or the depressing idea that since I'm having a birthday this year,
right,
that somehow I set up all of these productions as a self-celebration. So, I mean, it's nice to turn 80, you know, better than not being able to.
Yes.
But I didn't have anything to do with any of these productions. It's all wonderful accident that it's happening.
That it's all coming
So
together.
it wasn't a con job or anything.
I want to talk about Peter and Jerry, but I want to begin actually with the Zoo Story.
Okay.
The play that began your career, really. You were just telling me you wrote it, and I think I remember from reading in Mel Gusso's biography of you, 238 West
4th Street.
Where you lived in the Village at the time.
With 7 or 8 of my closest friends.
Oh, really? Was it a sort
tiny
of
little apartment, you know.
Yeah.
Sleep fast, we need the beds. One of those situations.
You were 30 years old.
Mm-hmm. Well, no, I was 28, actually.
You were 28 when you, okay. It was produced when you were
30,
right. So you were 28 years old, and there's a very good chapter in Mel's book about your life in Greenwich Village and being around artists, your friends.
It was such an exciting time.
Yeah.
I left home. I was an adopted kid and
right.
hated my adoptive family and the whole environment, though they did give me a very good education.
Mm-hmm.
And so I left home when I legally could when I was 18. And I got disowned, disinherited, and, you know, pretty much broke. But I moved to New York. That huge distance between Larchmont and New York City, 20 miles. It's a million miles, and I moved straight to Greenwich Village. And I lived there for the 10 years until I wrote the Zoo Story, and then afterwards, having the most wonderful time of my life. Mm-hmm. Everybody talks about, you know, the difficult period. It wasn't difficult.
Yeah.
I was getting to see all the most wonderful theater imaginable. We were seeing Beckett and Brecht and Pirandello and everybody. It was wonderful. And the abstract expressionist painters were painting.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That was new, and all the new music was
Copeland
being
was writing,
done up at Columbia.
Yeah.
And we go up there for the concerts. Nothing cost anything.
And
everybody sat around and liked everybody, had a wonderful time.
Yeah. Gusso describes you as a very quiet and retiring young man.
Well, I was there to learn a lot.
That you were just taking it in, and people were then surprised when you turned out to be so articulate, that you had so much to say, because you were so quiet.
Well, if you sit around for 10 years, you learn a few things, and then I suppose you feel you can open your mouth.
Well, I was curious.
But did you lack confidence in those days to speak up, or was it?
I didn't think in terms of confidence. I was a fairly shy kid.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
But there was so much fascinating going on all over the village and all of the arts, and so many interesting people to learn stuff from. So I just sat around and absorbed a great deal of stuff. I was learning all the time.
Now, you were a poet, correct?
Oh, I started off as a poet and failed at that, and I failed as a novelist, and I failed as a short story writer, and I failed as an essayist.
But you're not really failing. You're learning how to write, though, doing all those.
But within you, were you going, I'm going to tell you something someday?
I don't remember.
Well, here's something that Mel says that I found quite interesting. He says, was Edward a writer or simply an observer, destined to play a secondary role in other people's lives? Increasingly, there was a feeling of emptiness and perhaps the idea that he would become another creator who never lived up to his potential. As Edward himself said several years later, he was fed up with everything, including myself. Is that a fair assessment of where you were at that point in your life?
I hadn't written anything that was worthwhile. I mean, I've always been pretty good at knowing whether stuff is good or bad, myself or other people's. And I knew all the poetry and the novels and the short stories and the essays were crap. I knew that. They weren't any good. But I knew that I wanted to be a writer. And so I wrote the zoo story, and I thought, you know, this is somewhat better.
And you wrote the zoo story in 2 weeks, is that correct? Sitting
Probably 3.
At the kitchen
Two and a
table?
half. I had stolen, or liberated as I call it, a big typewriter from the Western Union Company where I was delivering telegrams.
Right.
And I lugged that. How I ever got it up those stairs, I don't know. Back to the apartment where we were all living. And I wrote the zoo story there in about 2.5 weeks, yeah. And it just seemed to pour out. And the interesting thing was, I knew when I finished that play that this was different. This was something that wasn't bad. This had some merit. And I was always objective about my work. And I knew the other stuff wasn't any good, but this was.
So for our viewers who aren't familiar with the zoo story,
Who would that be?
Well, but just
It's not a law. It doesn't have to be.
I don't know.
in your, what would you tell us that the zoo story is about? What happens in the zoo
It's
story?
about an hour.
But
You've used that before.
Yes.
What is it about?
So I say it's an encounter between
It is
two
about
men.
a man who works for a publishing house, reading in New York Central Park, back in the days when it wasn't worth your life to be sitting in Central Park reading. A man who has got a placid, well-organized, well-ordered life is accosted by a man named Jerry, who is exactly the opposite of him, who engages Peter in trying to understand this guy's life, refuses it, pretends he doesn't understand, which drives this guy, Jerry, to violence and ends up with Peter unintentionally killing the stranger, Jerry.
Yeah.
End of play.
Still a powerful
End of play.
work.
End of second act of
And
play.
why? and why did it catch on so? Why was it so successful? Do you believe? Why was this a breakthrough for you?
For me, it was a breakthrough for me because it was the first halfway decent thing I'd ever written.
Right.
But why was it accepted as
Yes.
well as it was? Well, I had a pretty good companion piece on the bill with that. It was called Krapp's Last Tape by Sam Beckett.
Oh, you're too modest.
which didn't hurt.
Mr. Beckett brought you through?
Well, some of the reviews liked the Beckett play a lot more than mine. Some of the others liked my play a lot more than the Beckett play. But this is a pretty healthy time off Broadway. It was just really beginning to get going, and here was a master like Beckett and a young playwright who apparently had written a play that amounted to something, and it was a pretty good combo. We ran for almost 3 years.
I wanted to get into home life in a second, but I was just curious when you said that the two radically different people, Peter lives a very comfortable middle-class life, not really engaging in his own life in some ways.
No, of course
and
not.
Jerry, who is ferociously engaged to the point of destruction in some ways in his life.
You ought to be a critic.
Thank you. I'm stealing it all from Mel. But Mel said that in some ways, as he was analyzing this play, that there were the two Edward Albees. There was the Edward Albee of Larchmont, of privilege, and as you said earlier, the Edward Albee who went 1,000,000 miles away and became the Edward Albee of the Greenwich Village. Is that a fair assessment of the biographical detail of this play?
Fairly fair, but not totally. If even as good a biographer as Mel, and he was a really good one, an honest, fair guy.
Absolutely.
Most biographers make a terrible mistake in assuming that the only place that creativity comes from is from the experience of the writer, which is such a ridiculous mistake. I am not Peter, I am not Jerry. I have never put myself in any of my plays. I invent characters. The limits to what I invent are my own perceptions, what I'm able to understand.
I think he was writing about what created your perceptions.
Okay, but he didn't make that point clear.
He did say one thing I thought was interesting, though, because I'm just interested in the specifics of how a play comes together, that your work as the delivery boy for Western Union, especially delivering telegrams,
Death messages to people, sure.
was quite influential in some ways in your perception.
Well, I met an awful lot of very, very interesting people during those 3 years or so that I was delivering telegrams.
At moments in crisis in their lives.
Yeah, most of it was on the then not so fashionable Upper West Side of New York City. You know, Central Park West and Riverside Drive were okay, but in those days, in the 50s, there was a mess in between.
I believe Jerry lives up in a rooming house in that area.
He did, yes, of course, about 76th Street, I think.
So the people you met delivering the telegrams float around in your mind as possible characters?
But I've always kept my eyes and ears open. You know, I'm going to get assaulted on the subway someday. I take the subway everywhere. It's the only place to get anywhere in New York City. And I'm always looking at people and listening to them. People are fascinating, you know.
Now, when you wrote the Zoo story, you then sent it off to Thornton Wilder.
No. Thornton Wilder read my poetry before and told me to write plays, which was perceptive of him. I think he was just trying to save poetry from me, though. I don't think he really meant to write plays. He could have said anything. No, I sent it to. I only knew composers in those days. Basically, I didn't know many writers. And one of the composers I sent the play to was David Diamond, who just died last year, alas. A very good American composer who was living in Italy at the time. And David read the play and liked it a lot, and he sent it to a friend of his, a Swiss-German actor-translator named Pincus Brown, who happened to be married to the daughter of the people who had gotten back after the Nazis were overthrown, a Jewish family, Fisher, who'd gotten back their publishing house, the S. Fisher Publishing House. And he sent it to Pincus Brown, David did, who translated it and sent it to Stephanie Hunzinger, who was my agent until she died a couple of years ago. Everybody's dying.
Yeah, exactly.
And she arranged for a production of my play, The Zoo Story, on a double bill with Beckett's play Krapp's Last Tape in German.
In Berlin.
In Berlin at the Schiller Theater of Werkstatt.
Yeah.
And so that's how the play managed to get its world premiere in Berlin. I had to go, of course.
And you were on your way. Why, after all these years, have you gone back to the play to write Act One?
Because I'm convinced that I had already written Act One, but I'd never put it down on paper. I thought the Zoo Story worked pretty well, but I also thought, you know, this is really a little one-sided. Peter doesn't have much to say in this play. He's sort of a backboard that Jerry bounces all of his ideas across. Maybe I didn't flesh out Peter enough, and that kept bothering me just a little bit. And finally, about 6 or 7 years ago, it occurred to me, well, why don't you fix it? Why don't you try to write a first act? Peter at home with his wife Anne before he goes to the park. Let's learn more about Peter. What's the interesting thing is, I still knew who Peter was. I hadn't thought about him for 30, 40 years. And I also knew who his wife Anne was, even though I'd never written a word for her. And I wrote Home Life in 2 weeks because I still knew who these people were. I knew their relationship. I'd retained it all these years. And so it wasn't like adding a new piece to an older play. It was like doing the first part of an older play.
Did you do it on the Liberated Western Union?
No, I still write. I write by longhand now.
You do?
It's called manuscript.
Yes. Not on a computer?
No, God, no. Somebody told me once a long time ago that maybe this is no longer true with computers. Somebody told me a long time ago that if you put something on a computer and you press the wrong buttons, the whole thing will erase. I don't want that.
No. No. The American Dream and The Sandbox at Cherry Lane, you're directing those plays.
Yeah. I've done that before.
Yes, I know. You've directed, I think you've directed most of your works. Yep. Is the best director of Edward Albee Edward Albee? No,
the director that gives, for the first time around, the most accurate representation of what was going on in the author's mind when he wrote the plays is me.
Yes.
Yeah, I can do that. So whenever I direct a play of mine, I can be very accurate to my intention, whether that's the best intention in the world or not. Yeah. It was what I intended. And every once in a while, I like to see that.
Have you've directed American Dream before at other places over the years?
Oh, yeah, sure. And now, Sandbox, both.
People have written that the American Dream and the Sandbox are you looking at your own family. And a young man's bringing forward his very privileged family and the problems with
Well,
him.
certainly both of those plays, which are satires, are a portrait of my adoptive family.
Yeah, your adoptive
the mother and father, whom I did not enjoy living with, and my maternal grandmother, who I thought was a lot of fun. She was a hoot. I liked her a lot, sure. But that didn't come out of me, that came out of them.
Do you still relate to these characters the same way so many years later?
Oh, sure, you have to. Of course.
There's been no evolution in your perception?
No, I mean, I wouldn't rewrite a play 40 years after I wrote it because I'm not the same person.
But then you came back to like writing about your adopted mother in
Three Tall Women.
Well, that was a real-life portrait.
Ah, I see. So, but not the satire of...
No, that was it.
I mean, is the difference between, you know, writing about your family when you're young and sort of the anger there, and then writing about your family when you're older and a more deeper understanding of why they behave the way they behave?
Well, when I got to writing Three Tall Women, the anger about my adoptive mother was still there, but I'd added something, a little pity.
Yeah.
So, in a way, then there was an evolution.
Yes, I wouldn't call it a softening. I would call it maybe a growing.
Me, Myself, and I, about identical twins.
Yeah, among other things.
Among other things, yeah.
I don't know what the damn play is about yet.
It's finished, though, right?
Oh, sure.
All ready to go? How do you hit on the idea of identical twins? And is it something?
Well, it's interesting. There are identical twins in the American Dream. That boy who shows up is the identical twin of the first kid they adopted and destroyed psychologically. So there are identical twins there. Isn't that interesting?
It is. What do you make of that?
I didn't even think about that when I was writing Me, Myself, and I, because I was after a different purpose, a different function of identical twins. The whole matter of being able to create your own identity and the extra question and problem of creating your own identity if you are two people who are the same.
Interesting.
So it's more about that than anything to do with the identical quality that permeated the American Dream.
How do you think your mind first went on to thinking about twins? Why were you thinking about twins in the first place?
In the American Dream?
Yeah.
I don't remember.
Right.
It's a very long time ago.
I mean, we ask you, it's funny because we ask you to analyze in this way yourself, which is very odd because most great writers don't put themselves forward in this way that you're sitting here and then we're trying to...
I can theorize with the best of them.
You can theorize. But did the theorizings of your plays ever get in the way of your writing?
No. Because every play I write... I've familiarized myself throughout my life with theatrical literature. I know the whole literature of theater, and I'm aware of the fact that I've written how many plays have I written now? I don't know, 28 or something like that, 29, 30 with this one probably. But every time I sit down to write a play, I write the first play I've ever written, and I also try to write the first play that anybody's ever written. And so I completely ignore everything that I know and go with whatever that particular thing needs and wants to be.
But that's a tremendous skill to be able to put yourself in that kind of new place.
You have to, or else you're writing thesis.
Many writers lose that ability.
Sure.
I mean, how are you able? Is there a technique you use that you're just able to sit down and clean your mind in this way and come to it new?
I don't know how it happens, and since creativity's black magic, it's probably best not examined too closely.
Right, yeah. It strikes me, though, that the characters are so powerful in the play. I mean, is that where you begin with a voice, with a character?
I begin with characters and find out who they are, and then if I know who they are, really know who they are, then I can trust them to be in the play. Then I start writing the play.
Now, with Occupant, about Louise Nevelson, who you were very close to, I believe.
That's a different matter.
Yeah, I mean,
the same as Three Tall Women.
Your mother.
And that's biography.
And when you wrote Occupant, was this a kind of attempt to understand this friend of yours, or she was such a powerful personality you wanted to capture?
It wasn't an attempt to understand her. I understood her before I wrote the play, or I couldn't have written the play. So,
but she was just a vibrant character that you wanted to...
She was a fascinating woman. The complexity of her life, the biography is so fascinating. And the Louise Nevelson that she created...
The eminent sculptor, right.
This object that she created for the world to see. I was interested in an audience seeing what caused that and what was underneath it, and the difference between the presented Louise Nevelson and the real Louise Nevelson. That fascinated me.
This
and
again,
of course, I waited until after Louise died before I wrote it, so she wouldn't hit me.
this then again becomes another question, though, as you said, with the identical twins, of identity, of creating. I mean, she decides she's really this, but she's going to become something else.
Yeah, that seems to be something that afflicts a lot of my plays, isn't it?
Yeah. Does it afflict you? I mean, is there the private Edward Albee and the public Edward Albee?
No, with Mel's book, there is no private Edward Albee left.
It's true. And so that is a wonderful book, and I get the sense
it's a good book because there is nothing hidden about my life. I've never seen anything in my life that other people shouldn't know about if they wanted to know about it. And Mel, a first-rate critic, good mind, and a nice guy, and we were good friends. I knew that sooner or later somebody was going to come along and write a biography about me. That sort of thing happens if you stick around long enough, And let's get a good one in there first before anybody can do anything else.
Yeah.
George Grizzard, wonderful actor who was the original Nick in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, died a couple of weeks ago.
I was very fortunate having George in 3 of my plays.
Delicate Balance, Seascape.
And Seascape.
Yeah, and Virginia Woolf. I read, though, in Alan Schneider's memoir that you were reluctant to have George play Nick originally because you thought Nick should be a more strapping football linebacker.
I remember it differently. I remember being quite taken with George's abilities. He was a young guy. He was, 28, 30, when the proper age when he played Nick. All I remember of it, I don't remember saying to Alan, though I may have, is he large enough for the role? But I remember George coming up to me saying, "Do you think I'm too small for the role?" And I remember saying something, rehearsed and clever, like any actor can be any size they want to be, and don't worry about it. So, but probably a little truth both there. Maybe it did concern me that I had conceived of Nick as more of a bruiser. But once George got into rehearsal, and I saw the subtlety in which he played and the aggressiveness that he could do so cleverly, I had no problem with having George in the play at all. I'm sorry he had to leave so soon. He left after 3 months.
I think subtle is a good way to describe George. That's the sense I always got watching him. It was never any flashy, actory kind of tricks with him.
No, I've never seen any better playing Tobias in A Delicate Balance than George.
Brilliant.
He was so wonderful in that.
Yeah, I always thought he had the upper class elegance of your characters, but also the kind of anger and emptiness or lost quality about him that is.
Well, he was a first-rate actor. He could play a lot of things.
Yeah.
He could play more than one thing.
I want to ask you one last thing, though, about backstage. I always heard that he and Elaine Stritch were at war with each other during A Delicate Balance. Was that true?
Yes.
How bad? Was that a George and Martha situation?
I can't quote some of the things that George would say to Stritch during curtain calls, because this is a family program.
Right. All right, Edward Albee, it's always a great pleasure having you on Theater Talk. Don't miss Peter and Jerry, now at Second Stage. Me, Myself, and I at the McCarter Theater in Princeton.
In January.
With a possible New York transfer in the works.
Hope so.
For the spring. The American Dream and Sandbox at the Cherry Lane, which you're directing.
April.
And Occupant at the
or
Signature
March,
Theater.
whichever it is.
In March, yes. 4 plays together. Not bad for an 80-year-old.
Well, as long as it's not for that. As long as they're going to stop next year?
I hope not.
Hope not.
As long as you don't stop. Edward, thanks a lot for being our guest. Always
My pleasure.
Tell us a little bit about the character you're playing. I mean, how do you see him and how do you approach him?
I see him like a judge that I knew when I was a little boy from North Carolina, who was our congressman. And he was a small-town judge, and he went to Congress, and he got my father an appointment to the government in Washington, and that's how I grew up in Washington. And he's a small-town, moral, wily Southerner. And I, I throw in a lot of curlicues of my own, but that's kind of who I have in mind.
How do you find the play hits an audience now?
I tell you, my favorite sound in the theater is dead silence, and we get that a lot. That means they're listening.
One of the things the play